Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Coastal Studies Institute. I'm Andy Keeler, head of the public policy program here. We're delighted to host the marvelous exhibition you've all just seen and heard here at Coastal Studies Institute. We know that we learn about the world from instruments and data, but we also learn about the world from people, their experiences, and the stories they tell. As ECU expands its Outer Banks campus, we at CSI are committed to expanding the role of the visual, musical, and literary arts in understanding how we see the natural environment on which we all depend. Baxter and Ryan's work that you've just seen is an exceptionally clear example of how valuable this kind of work is. And we hope to continue to work with them and others to bring new perspectives to what the university can bring to this community and to the way we all see the world. We're really, really fortunate to be able to hear directly from a panel of coastal North Carolina residents who all participated in this project. I have a few initial questions for them to get their views out, and after that, we'll turn it over to the audience for questions and discussion. I'll now briefly introduce our wonderful panel. Immediately to my left is Baxter Miller, the principal photographer, one of the driving forces behind Rising. Much of her work as a visual storyteller and communications specialist focuses on the intersection of place, culture, tradition, and people in coastal communities. She's a descendant of some of the first European settlers on Hatteras Island. To her left is Ben Cahoon. Ben grew up on a family farm in Engelhard, has practiced architecture in Nags Head for 30 years, where he now serves as mayor, is a former CSI board member, and was a member of the design team that actually designed this beautiful building in which we are fortunate enough to work, and you guys are all fortunate enough to see this program. Then immediately to the left there is Lauren Salter, a lifelong Down East resident and fourth-generation descendant of Down East commercial fishing families. She's a member of the North Carolina Coastal Resources Commission and has worked for both the NC Fisheries Association and the state's Division of Marine Fisheries, which is kind of like, you know, being on both sides in a war. So I'm sure you've got some good stories from that.
I've been on all sides of the war.
To her left, standing in for his wife, who unfortunately couldn't make it, is Captain Ernie Foster of Hatteras. He's fished out of Hatteras since he was 13 years old. He owns the historic Albatross fleet that's been operating since 1937, has been recognized for billfish conservation by both the Billfish Foundation and, again, the International Game Fish Association. He's been a member of the Dare County Tourism Board, serves on the board of the Coastal Federation and Dare County's Oregon Inlet and Waterways Commission. Ernie is a former science teacher and still is directly participating in the creation of scientific knowledge by taking our scientists at CSI and NOAA researchers out to the Gulf Stream for data collection. And finally, last but far from least, Karen Willen-Amsbacher is the executive director of Corsound Waterfowl Museum and Heritage Center, a lifelong Down East resident and a direct descendant of the people that were part of the Diamond City to Harkers Island migration at the end of the 19th century. Still, as far as I know, the most dramatic reaction to climate events so far in eastern North Carolina. So thank you all for being here, and we'll sort of let you guys do this in whatever order you want, but the first question I'd like you to address is that we all know barrier islands in the estuarine shoreline have never been stable in coastal North Carolina. They've been changing ever since people have lived here. Could you talk a little bit about how you see what's been happening over the past decade or so and what you expect to see in the future, and whether you think it's really a continuation of the kind of constant change we've seen in the past, or there's something different going on now? You'll never see this panel this speechless again.
Go, Ernie.
Okay, I grew up in Hatteras in a house that flooded with every tide. We had stoppers in the floor to let the water in so that the house would not float away. So the notion that we have tide and storms is not anything new or different. The most dramatic change that I am seeing right now, and I'm kind of fascinated that I haven't heard coastal geologists get more excited about it, is over the last, I guess, 4 years, maybe 5, the erosion of the north side of Hatteras Inlet to the north has been dramatic. Along the eastern seaboard, inlets do not migrate north. The south side of Hatteras Inlet is roughly stable. It's moved a little bit to the south, maybe. but the north end of Hatteras Island has eroded away at least a mile, probably more. And that's a pretty remarkable change. It creates some pretty serious issues. The ferry channel going to Ocracoke has had to change. The charter boats are constantly having to figure out their own way to use the inlet. We mark it ourselves. The Coast Guard is somewhat stymied in some of their emergency response efforts, and that's significant. And up and down the island, I guess the state has pretty much has permanent equipment to move the sand around as needed. So we're seeing some fairly significant changes. I can go on a little bit more, but that's probably enough.
I would say it's definitely different. I mean, I'm too young to speak to much historical, but the rate at which, I mean, just today, we have a Category 4 historic storm in Florida that came kind of out of nowhere. So I'd say it's definitely different. It's definitely changing. I mean, I think coastal communities have always been pretty good at adapting to their environment and what they have to do, so I feel certain we'll continue to do that. I just think we're going to have to get really innovative about how we do it, but the first thing that we're going to have to do is admit that it's happening. That seems to be the biggest challenge that I see. So I'll pass it.
Okay, thank you. I'll address this at a couple of different ways. First, the physical impact. Speaking for myself and the town of Nags Head, a couple of effects. One is oceanfront erosion, beach erosion, which the town has a mechanism to deal with. It's a very expensive solution, but we do beach nourishment. We do that, in my mind, to protect the infrastructure in which the town is invested, like our streets, water lines, power lines, that kind of thing. I say that, you know, there's a perception that we're benefiting the oceanfront property owners. I turn that around and say, what we're doing is we're trying to protect our infrastructure. We have the benefit of taxing the oceanfront property owners in order to do that. They just happen to be between us. They happen to be between our road and water line and the beach and the things that we're trying to protect. So we see beach erosion. The other thing that we see in the town of Nags Head, and I think across eastern North Carolina, is just the elevated water table and the effect that that has. Historically, the town of Nags Head has relied on shallow stormwater basins to collect and deal with stormwater. As the water table comes closer to the bottom of those basins, they become less effective in dealing with the stormwater. Same thing with wastewater systems. As the water table rises, those systems become less effective. We end up with more pollutants in the groundwater and in the outfalls to which the runoff eventually goes. So those are the physical effects that we see. In terms of changes in the last decade or two, well, let me back up. One more thing. We live on a relatively high lot in the town of Nags Head, one of the higher parcels. We've had water in our yard substantially twice, and that's only recently. That's only was Matthew and then a storm in June. So the increased rainfall, the intensity of rainfall, and the fact that the water table is elevated is the general effect that we see in our neighborhoods in Nags Head. One of the other changes, I think, that's sort of fundamental to this issue, this tension between living in a place like this that's dynamic and our economic well-being, is that we've so firmly fixed the abstract concept of real estate. It used to be like in Nags Head, the parcels went from the ocean to the sound, shoreline to shoreline. The shoreline changed, the parcel changed. Then we put pins in the corners, and it became a fixed place. And now we fix those corners with GPS digitally down to hundredths of a foot, and that's our space. And we We borrow against it. We put it in our financial statements. We leave it to our children, and we become incredibly invested in this concept that we can't change. And so then we start to serve that abstract by needing to keep sand under it, keep sand in front of it, keep the water off of this abstract thing that we've created. And it's kind of an inverse way of looking at rising. It's not so much how do we persist in a place where water is rising, it's why do we persist in living in a place where the water was destined to rise? And in part, it's because of the mechanisms we've created to live here.
Pass it on to Karen next.
I like being on the end. I'll throw this out for conversation, but I think the part that's changed the most is us. There's more of us. We expect different things than my grandparents expected out of Shackelford Banks. They lived with it. And I've told this story over and over during this rising ride we've been on. Maybe 12, 15 years ago, a good friend who's a realtor on the beach called me and said, Karen, you got to help me. I said, what do you need? She said, well, we're trying to get a sand tax passed, and we're having community meetings all around the county, and we need for you to get together some Dianese people and talk to them. I said, honey, I can't do that. And she said, why? I said, because they'll shoot me. And she said, what do you mean? I said, here's what you got to understand. For the most part, at least at that point, I don't know how the population of Dianese adds up now, but in my lifetime, for the most part, the people who live down east are descendants of people who migrated to higher ground. They come off of Portsmouth, or they come off of Shackelford. They hunting quarters, all down east were people that lived on the edge, literally, and they didn't really expect that land to stay the same. And the concept of thinking that you've got enough money and enough smarts and enough engineers to stop the ocean is a fallacy. I've sit here and watched storms in 30 minutes take away what it took $50 million to put on there in a whole season. So are we realistic in thinking that we can get 2 summers out of a beach renourishment project? Is it worth the investment? I ask that question. I ask it a lot. I ask it a lot in Carteret County, and they keep telling me about how beach renourishment is a good investment for the county because all those property owners on both banks are keeping my taxes down. Well, I could argue that math. My mother's taxes on Hatteras Island went up 4 times in one revow. So I think we're the ones that might need consideration on rethinking how we approach living on the coast. It was never meant, it's never been still, it's never stayed in the same place. We just borrow a little time and take that as part of the project. I was born there, and I want to stay there. And like Ernie Foster said, I want to wash away there. That's just the way it is. But when people buy on the coast, they buy the risk. And we need to quit thinking about it as downtown Raleigh, because it's not.
Well, I'm going to be here more to help facilitate some more questions than anything, but I'm curious, Ernie, if you feel, how does what you've seen change over the last decade compare to the rest of your life on Hatteras? Yep. You can answer too, Karen.
I don't know that it has changed. Well, the one thing that is dramatic, and it's psychologically, it's somewhat difficult for me to look at the way the north end of Hatteras Inlet is eroding away. I'd be lying if I said that wasn't a challenge. When I'm out in the boat and riding along the shore side and I see the trees being eaten away and the hills that were there all of my life being gone, it's more than a little concerning. On the other hand, let's see, in the Ash Wednesday storm of 62, which cut an inlet, what is now Canadian Hole, that was fairly dramatic. Pretty exciting trying to get off the island. We had to use 2 ferries instead of 1. It's a long ferry ride from Hatteras to Kennekeet. But the erosion on the south end of the island is the single thing that just jumps out at me right now. And I'm living with it and been in and out of that inlet fishing all of my life. That's a bit of a challenge.
So I'm going to jump in here to kind of go to something Karen said, because I agree with that very much, and yet I'm down there and I don't want to leave like you. I plan to wash away down there. So, and I got a lot of years hopefully before I do that. So I think the way we build, you know, and what we expect has to change, but the way that we place ourselves there might have to change, because my home just flooded. It's the first time that it's ever been recorded to have flooded since they've been keeping records on it. So our plan is to try to raise our home instead of just hoping it won't happen again. That might not do it. You know, who knows in 20 years if that'll be enough. But I think to just kind of think that we can stay here the same way, we can't do it. I mean, I understand they left Diamond City, but they had somewhere to go to. You know, because everything is so fixed now, where do I go? And I have so much money invested in that property, and I'm young, so how do you just move? So that is a hard question, so it might be a matter of how we stay.
Question.
Turn it over to you.
Thanks. So sort of as a natural follow-on to that, the next question I'd like you guys to address, and I guess especially Lauren, since we met your beautiful young daughter, but also Karen, because her comments spoke directly to this, is you guys very articulately said, we're of this place, we're staying here, and a lot of us who aren't from here have come here because we want to be here. But what kind of advice or counsel or stories would you tell the next generation, people who are young children or teenagers now? What would you tell them to think about how to plan their lives if they want to live here? And what would you tell people who are in their teens and 20s and come from somewhere else and say, gee, I love it here, I want to make my life here? What concerns and what advice would you have for them?
When I saw this question earlier, I thought more of the teen and the 20-somethings who, kids coming out of college who might be interested in this place, having a permanent relationship with this place. And it goes to some of the things that have already been said. I think you have to be flexible. You have to understand that this environment is dynamic and that all the constructs that allow us to live here need to be dynamic and flexible as well. Also that you need to understand the risk and build those into every decision. Your decision of where you live, where you work, how you get to work, how you budget your money, where you store your things. I mean, to some degree, Baxter and Stancil have been living for the last couple of weeks the experience that I would urge people to be prepared for, which is things can change on a moment's notice, and you just have to acknowledge that. If you're going to live in Raleigh, you can almost throw a dart at a map and find a house that's not going to get flooded while you live there for 20 years. And you can put your business on a street corner and run it 24/7, 365, and your customers can probably get to your place of business 24/7, 365. Choose to live on the Outer Banks. If you can hit the Outer Banks with a dart, you're much more likely to find a place to live that will flood in your lifetime. So you need to be aware of that. And that you need to be careful with the way, with all the choices you make, because your customers can be cut off for weeks at a time at a moment's notice. If you're living day to day, or your business model is a day-to-day business model, then that's not going to work for you. And you just have to acknowledge this. You know, if some places you can live and be careless, if you're going to live here, you have to be super careful and super vigilant with every decision.
I was sitting here thinking, they're asking about young people, and I've had a lot of conversations, you know, Florence was this generation's, the young people's first experience with a real storm. Isabel was Lauren's first experience with a real storm. What grade were you in, Isabel? You were in college. My daughter's 30. 2 days before Florence, the weather report was a Category 4, just like the crowd in Florida are going through right now, a Category 4 to just scrape by Hatteras Island. I mean, every time that newsman would do this, he'd hit us right in the top of the head. So my mother is 89, and I decided in Walmart that morning that she needed to go because there's, I don't know how many bridges between her and a hospital. So 7, 9, count them, whatever. But anyway, so she left, and I made arrangements, and she went to Cary. I came home to Katie, my daughter, who's 30, and I said, Katie, you need to go. I said, take the dog, and you go to AP's. She lives in Greensboro. And she said, Mom, I don't want to go. And I said, and then her daddy stepped in, and I said, okay, Katie, I said, if you're staying, you need to understand that this is more than you've ever been through before, and you will be different. And you're going to have to tote the load of this storm. And she has, and she did. And she won't be the same. And we were lucky. We just had Tide under the house, not in the house. But she has watched people around her suffer and suffering still. Not suffering to the point that they can't recover, but when you're laying there at night with a tarp on the roof and now there's another storm coming, that's pretty hard to deal with. I was in a meeting this morning at schools. We're distributing relief through the classroom teachers. And the problem with the Downey schools is nobody will ask for help. And the people we've given help to have given it back. And that's why I love them, and that's why I ain't going nowhere. Guilty. Yeah, that's right. I mean, we're trying to help each other, and it's hard. So I'm proud of Katie for staying, because this is what makes us who we are, Ernie Foster. If we lived in an environment that was perfect all the time, yeah, and of course I say whatever I think, so here it goes. Somebody was talking about Cary, North Carolina. I said, yeah, it's like them Sim cities that you played on the computer, and the trees are all the same height, and the bushes are all the same height. You can't find no signs because they're all covered up in greenery. You know, we don't live in Cary, North Carolina. But if you want perfect, go to Cary. Everything's just right. There's an ordinance to protect you from everything there. Go to Cary. Go to Cary. If you want to live life in a real coastal community on the coast with all its beauty and all its meaning, I'm not just talking about pretty sunsets, but I'm talking about meaning and life and culture and the things that matter to people like Lauren and Ernie and I, then go live to Hatteras or Ocracoke and take the risk and be part of a community that can take care of itself. Because at the end of the day, if you got a foot of tide in your yard or 3 foot or 3 inches, it's what goes on around you that really makes life. We'll get cleaned up. You know, the trees are all black and brown. I went to Raleigh one day last week. I said, thank you for letting me see green grass again, because everything is weathered and beaten, and we are too. And that's only right, that those people who live in these communities are a part of it. That just doesn't mean on the pretty days. That means in that 36 hours that Florence beat us. And my heart breaks for the crowd on the Panhandle of Florida tonight because they're getting beat up. But I doubt they're going to leave either. That hardcore crowd, that crowd of fishermen, they ain't going nowhere either.
So all this makes me think of something my daddy, who's from Harters Island, tells me: if you're going to be dumb, you better be tough. That comes to mind. That's how I feel about it. You know, we know what we're up against. We see it. It might seem dumb to some people, but we're going to do it anyway. But we're tough. But talking about taking care, this is just funny. My husband, after the storm, it was killing him, all this debris across, we call it the stretch between Davis and Williston, where I live and my grandmother lives. And there's all this debris, and he kept worrying about emergency vehicles, and he kept looking around, and nothing was happening. So he went and got on my stepdad's tractor, and he goes out on the stretch, and he clears it that morning.
We don't have a time to go.
Right, and he cuts down trees off the highway so that people can get through because he's worried about it. And that evening, we were coming back home, and here comes the state truck to clean the road. But he said, "They've messed it up. I had that looking so good." Because they came with that machine and wiped some of it back on the road, and he had it perfectly fixed. So we know how to take care of ourselves. You know, you get used to it.
The question of what do you say to young people, in my mind, gets mixed up. I'm someone who, by and large, sees myself, I guess that's the science teacher in me, as being fairly rational and somewhat logical. And after a storm, you know, if you look at the press, there's the folks all over the place saying, why in the heck do those people stay in a place like that? What's wrong with them? Move. And there's a significant amount of logic to that. So the question is, why do those two stay there?
Like you do.
Well, I'm in Hatteras, it's different. And there are any number of emotional components to this. The notion that all of my grandparents were born on the island. The notion that we are so completely interconnected with the natural surroundings. Yes, when I was young and went off to college, I just wanted to see the real world. And for whatever reason, the last few years, it's begun to dawn on me, or at least I believe it, that perhaps I'm connected to a real world. It seems better than the suburbs. And those that move, you know, those of us who were born there and live there, you have this connection that you just can't simply discard. And it's not all rational and logical, but it's a part. All of life isn't just rational thought. There's an emotional connection as well. The young people that move to Hatteras, no one gets transferred there by their corporate business. You don't get promoted to a bigger job in Hatteras. You don't get high-paying jobs there. You get young people who come there looking for fishing, for kiteboarding, surfing, walking on empty beaches, the connection with nature, and what you find is this connection with each other. When the going gets tough, it's kind of nice to be in a place where the first thing everyone does is start trying to help their neighbor. That isn't, it's a human quality, but it seems to evidence itself very strongly in isolated communities. The other part of it, and I'm speaking specifically about what I know, is in Hatteras, no one moves there because of the amenities. You know, the notion that you're going to be 2 or 3 days without access to the hospital or access to this or that is the norm. It's not the exception. So that when folks from afar start trying to inquire as to what is the mental derangement that provides the mechanism to keep those people there, it's kind of challenging to explain it to them. You know, that no one there thinks that not being able to get to the hospital within 15 minutes is somehow a bad thing. No one thinks that having to help your neighbor after a storm is an inconvenience. You know, it's just part of how life goes on. So what do you tell young people? I think that was really the question. The young people, and my other part of the education thing, I was in the guidance counselor business. I did live at the north end of Roanoke Island for a few years. It isn't as though they are blank slates. It's not as though they show up without thinking about what they're doing. Some provide more thought than others, but they are looking for a variety of things and for the excitement and for being able to live a life without it all being just cookie cutter existence. Those that move to Hatteras who can't deal with the inconveniences get out. After every storm, a percentage of the folks who have moved in over the last 2 or 3 years are gone. Whatever it takes, and those who were born there who can't deal with it, they leave also. My advice to the young people that move there is try to be informed about what it's like to be there and make your own decision.
I think it's also really easy to underestimate what the emotional trauma is of going through something like this when you're impacted. I certainly underestimated it for my whole life until Florence. And I mean, it's overwhelming. Lauren and I were just talking about this the other day, that you really don't even know what to do next except to just keep doing something. So I would really underscore how emotionally overwhelming it is to experience a loss in these types of weather events. But Karen, I was going to ask you if you were comfortable talking about your kid's reaction to the will. Yeah.
Okay. I have this son. He and Lauren were probably the two smartest kids in that class, actually. Yeah, they were. And the difference between Lauren and Casey is Casey was smart, but he didn't have a lick of sense. Lauren was smart and she had good sense. But anyway, Casey is Casey, and he went to school of science and math and then on to Columbia University. He lives in New York City. And so I don't get to see him much, but I think it was last Christmas, or maybe the one before, they're all running together. You know, Jimmy Amspacher, the husband, he's even older than I am. I think he's even older than Ernie. No, nobody's older than Ernie. So, so anyway, so we're trying to get our affairs in order, being life is like it is. And so I asked Casey, he was home for Christmas. I said, because we got our house that we live in right now at Marshallburg, that was my grandmother's house, and it was her grandmother's house. So Katie's the 6th generation in that house. And then there's Mama's house, which is on Hatteras Island, which was part of 60 acres that my great-grandfather bought in 1903, 60 acres for $60. And Mama lives on that piece of land. So I got 2 children. So I was asking Casey, he's the oldest. I said, Casey, I said, you know, we're doing this, and I want to know which house you want. And in typical Casey way, he thought we were riding down the road. I don't know if we were going to the airport, from the airport, but he says, how about neither? And my heart died. if you knew me, you would know that my whole life is about place and culture and community and all that. And my son doesn't want either of the home places. And I said, why, Casey? He said, because they're not going to be here in 50 years. And I think that was the moment when Rising became very real to me. It's that, okay, my son is smarter than I am, and he's got this figured out in his logical mind, and he's probably right and I'm probably wrong, but I ain't changing now. But it was a startling moment, and it is a hard reality. And I do think my experience with Rising and being with Baxter and Ryan in all kinds of situations over the past, how long have we been friends? I don't know, a lifetime. And having these conversations, it has sea level rise, or whatever you want to call it, erosion, I don't care what number you give it. A changing world is much more prevalent on our minds now. You know, all kinds of information are, us news freaks, people who love to read, people who care about their community, we know more than my grandmother knew on Shackelford Banks in 1879. They live from day to day, and now we think we're living from century to century, and we're going to plot out a real estate portfolio that's going to continue to grow, and our grandchildren are going to be filthy, dirty rich. That wasn't on Addie Guthrie's mind. So I will say all that's going on in my head, in my heart, and in my family, and in my community, I am thankful that there are people who care about what we think and what we're doing and where we are on the planet and in this place. And I hope that Rising will continue to initiate conversations with people who just got here and people who've been here forever, and those people on Facebook who say, why didn't they just leave? I mean, you don't even want to know some of the conversations that was coming on Facebook during that, because it's not that easy. I left twice for Fran and Floyd and almost got killed in both places I went. It's not an easy decision. They say it's only a place, it's only a building, it's only things. Well, maybe not. Maybe not Baxter when it's those family heirlooms. Maybe it's not when it's home place. You know, okay, it's hard. It's very hard. And in circumstances, it is smart to leave. My mother needed to leave. She will never be the same, but she needed to leave. But we stood the course, and we're okay. We could take care of ourselves, but everybody has to make their own decision, and we have to respect it, whether it's staying there in a storm or building on a piece of land that's probably going to get flooded. We have to respect each other and what their relationship is to place and their family and what their decisions are. We have to respect it.
I think my advice would be to vote.
Yeah, that too.
Thank you all. That was incredibly interesting and very moving. I think we now have time for some questions from the audience, both here and possibly the online audience.
I think of one thing that Ernie was talking about and what Ben Cahoon mentioned. I think a lot of what we see is really an increase in perception of something that's always existed. I can remember being in Avon 40 years ago on a legal matter that I was doing. It was pointed out to me there were no two houses in Avon that faced the same direction. How come? Hurricanes came, the houses floated, they floated around, and wherever they came down, that's where they stayed. People just swapped property. And if anybody has ever been an attorney and tried to do title searches in Avon, you've got a problem. And, you know, Rodanthe was the same way. I can remember my uncle's wife, I think she might be kin to Baxter, or Baxter may be kin to her. She was living in Rodanthe, and she talked about the same thing. The water came in, everybody moved up to the second floor. Till the water receded, and they went on with life. Because back then, you probably couldn't get on Toby Tillett's ferry to get off the island, so there was no choice. You had to stay. And these things have been going on for ancient years and years and years. I was involved in you may remember the Phipps lawsuit, where the Phipps family claimed all the oceanfront property from Buxton right on down to Hatteras Inlet. And we were trying to represent the local landowners. And we were able to put the original grants on the ground because of Francis Creek, which is a three-pronged creek. And it was showed up on like a 1710 state grant survey, and all the other grants fit right together just like a jigsaw puzzle, and figured out there'd been over 1,700 feet of erosion. And that was about 1980. And so that's been going on since forever. I can remember in the 50s seeing the north end of Roanoke Island eroding at about 12 or 13 feet a year, and the caskets in the cemetery up there sticking out of the side of the sandhill. And so I think a lot of it's like you say, Mayor Cahoon, that people, we're marking the property, we're marking the territory. This is our territory. I did a deposition of a lady back in about 1971 in a boundary suit. She was in Elizabeth City. She was in her 90s. She had lived in one of the original cottages that were hauled over from the sound side to the ocean. And she said in her lifetime, it had been moved back from the ocean 3 times. Mm-hmm. And this was in 1971 or 2. So, you know, we're perceiving something in more detail that I guess used to be taken for granted.
Well, you know, and I think you're right, and I think several of the speakers here have kind of alluded to this, that it's us more than it is the natural change. I mean, this is the arc of the way environment changes anyway. You know, I'll give you an example from Nag's Head, for example. A lot of people don't realize that the dunes along the oceanfront were built by the WPA. They're not a natural thing. They're not a natural feature of the environment. They've allowed us to develop to a greater deal behind them because they protect us from a lot of the high surf, but they're not a natural feature. There are property owners in Nag's Head of the old family cottages that have been there for generations who don't have a dune in front of their house because it got washed out, and we might like for them to put it back because it would reduce the amount of flooding that ends up on the beach road, but they say that's the way it's supposed to be. The water's supposed to come under the house, move back out. And if we build the dune, then we've sort of disturbed what always happened. I mean, that the way that they built was a more natural response to the way that the environment operated. And to the point I tried to make, maybe could have been made better earlier, is that, you know, the natives lived here for thousands, maybe tens of thousands of years with moving barrier islands. Didn't matter to them, only matters to us because we try to own it and rent it and hold it in a fixed place. So.
A couple of comments along those lines. When I was a boy, tourism had not really taken off. And the locals considered beachfront property as a place where nobody in their right mind would build a house. All the villages on Hatteras Island were as far away from the ocean as you could get. Strangely enough, it was because they saw what was happening on the ocean front. Another piece of that, one of the pictures of the piling sticking up out of the water that you saw, that's Hatteras Inlet Coast Guard Station on the south side of Hatteras Inlet. Those pilings are still there. My father talked with me, he said, yeah, when I was a kid, we played baseball southeast of there about half a mile. So this notion of the changing of the island or the changing of the beachfront it has been forever. It is only now that we have fixed it that we're seeing the major problems.
I tell this story a lot when we're talking about this project because it was one of the stories that really inspired this project. But we have a piece of land that's been in our family forever on the back road in Buxton. And it was at one time stretched across most of the island, as Ben was talking about, lots did back then. And my grandfather's sister offered him a piece of land that now some of the Buxton motels at the north end of the village sit on, the ones that, are constantly battling the ocean overwash. And this was in the 70s. She offered him this piece of land for $3,000, and he said, no fool would ever build on the beach. And every time my dad has ever told this story, you can kind of see his eyes glaze over and stare up at the ceiling and with a tinge of regret that, that property now is worth millions. Who knows how much and how much land it really was back then. But there was something in what my grandfather said that was really important that I think we've gotten away from.
So I tell people all the time that I remember being a very little girl in Davis First Baptist Church singing the song about the wise man built his house upon the rock. The rains came down, the water came up, and I learned that at 3. The wise man builds his house upon the rock. The fool builds his house on the sand.
Questions?
Thank you. So in trying to return to maybe more of a dynamic way of building along the coast, do you feel a regulatory tool like setback factors from the oceanfront are useful or valuable, or can they not keep up with the rate of change that's happening? And what do you think they would be effective on the sound side as well?
I think when I think of the town and the planning process and what we tried to do in recognition of sea level rise, you have to think about it at a lot of different levels. Yes, there is a regulatory level that for the next 20 or 30 years may be effective so that we can sort of keep the next generation out of trouble to the maximum extent that we can. But there is a longer range picture where, these barrier islands really want to move. And at some point, there will be enough sea level rise that we can't pump the sand enough to hold the shore. I think we'll pump sand until we can't, but at some point, we really are overwhelmed and have to move at a larger scale beyond just a setback. How do we deal with that? How do we undo this real estate construct that we have and have an exit mechanism so that we can move? I mean, first you have to make a really painful decision about abandoning your community, but we bind ourselves to this real estate tighter and tighter financially and as a society, and without an exit mechanism, as soon as the storm is over, everybody goes back to New Orleans. They build their houses back on the same lots where the houses were just destroyed. And until we figure out long-term what that exit is, yes, we can regulate to some degree. There is also another, I don't know if I'll get another chance to make this point. There's sort of a third level, which is the even more immediate, and Karen told a particularly painful version of the way this happens, is that how does this play out over time? You know, it's not one big surge of water and we all get wiped out and we disappear. It's 1,000 painful decisions about whether living on a lot is viable, or about whether your children want the property that you grew up on, or whether you've been flooded 3 times, do you really want to put the emotional and financial energy into putting it back together again, or do you walk away from it regardless of what the financial consequences are? And the way this plays out is house by house and lot by lot and farm field by farm field until it's gone. But that's a long, painful arc, and I don't see any way around that, frankly.
I've heard people talking about their, down in Hatteras, after a storm, the house that's on your property, all of a sudden that's yours, and the house that was yours on somebody else's property, that's theirs. And you want to stay there, and I hear some people, their children don't want the house because it's not going to be there. Has anybody ever thought of the idea that they use it at Lake Mead and places like that? There's houseboats. There's 3-story houseboats that are communities. Now, you don't want those 1-story houseboats by your 3-story. But when the storm is coming a week before, instead of having guys who mow your lawn or take care of your pool, they have little tugboats, and they bring your house inland a ways. It would take time, but you could still have your house.
One of the things that is interesting to me now in Hatteras Village since Matthew, you know, we sit here and make the case that we want things to stay the way we are. We're vested in that. You don't really want to change. Since Matthew, at least 40 houses in Hatteras Village have been raised no less than 8 feet higher than they were before. And this idea of making changes of some magnitude bit by bit, that is an example. Now, it's not moving away, but the next Matthew will not flood as many local homes in Hatteras as the last one did. I hope.
That's true down east. In Isabel, which was like this generation's big storm, there were 625 homes down east that were flooded. I don't know what the count is this time, but I would say 60%, if not more, of those houses flooded in Isabel have been raised. And the flooding was a lot less this time. It was a whole different crowd of people, like Lauren, where she is. The flooding was in different places. But had those houses not been raised, they would all flooded again, too. So Carmine Prioli wrote a book about Harkers Island called Hope for a Good Season, and he talks about the people of Harkers Island adapting. He starts out with the crowd at Diamond City and how they moved to Harkers Island and they adapted. I think that's the word that we need to think about, is how do we adapt? Because this coast is a beautiful place to live. I understand why people want to live here. I think there should be an owner's manual when they come. Jimmy, the husband, before we lost power on the Weather Channel, whoever idea that was, it was a good thing, I guess. But somebody from Atlantic Beach on the second row of the beach called in to Jim Cantori or whoever it was that night and wanted to know if the surge was going to bother her house on the second row of Atlantic Beach. realtor people tell a realtor to be honest. I know that's hard, but seriously, we want these retirement communities. We welcome retirees with skills and resources and time to help us all do the work we do. But maybe there's like living on the coast 101 and we go through simulation games. I don't know, but you got to live through it to understand it. But I'm not sure that we're preparing people who move here for what's coming, because they expect the lights to be back on the next morning and they're not. The other thing that I wanted to, in thinking about tonight, was in this whole conversation about sea level rise, and I'm not sure if you heard Lauren's comment about voting. That is an important element of this, and we've been very sensitive and cautious in this project to make sure that we opened the conversation to everybody for their perspective. And I have listened in the past 3.5 weeks, whatever it is about this storm. I have heard people in my community, successful, intelligent people, talking about, please help everybody understand that this is not sea level rise, this is rainwater. This is rain. This is this, this is that. And I think I've pretty much given up on educating anybody above the age of 18 on this concept, because their perspective and their knowledge base has been based on whether they're watching CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, or nothing. And that shapes everything. I throw out a call that we get middle school kids involved in what's happening around them, and let's change the conversation past the hot buttons, and let's talk about the reality, because they're the ones that's going to have to live with the decisions we're making, and they're going to have change just like I've had, and like my grandmother had, and my children and grandchildren. The conversation has got completely derailed, and we're living in it. I don't care what you call it. When we had the conversation with Rising at my museum, we had people there from Smith Island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, and it was a very interesting conversation, because they're still waiting for the president to bring them a wall like Tangier's going to get. But we were very respectful, and they talked about erosion, we talked about frequent storms, we're all talking about it, but nobody's connecting the dots, and I'm not sure we were going to connect the dots on a collective, agreeable way to deal with it. We do it family by family. But I say educators, researchers, science community, there needs to be some pressure on coastal states and the curriculum these kids are getting in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade to really talk about it. And I know teachers who cannot talk about it in their classroom, and that's a sad reality.
So I deferred on your question earlier about regulations, because I've very recently been appointed to the CRC, and I have a feeling I'm going to get a deep education about it really quick. But I don't really know about it right now. But what I do know a lot about is commercial fishing, because I grew up in commercial fishing, and I worked for the Marine Fisheries Commission for 7 years, the Division 9 years, and then I worked for Fisheries Association almost 2. And what I found there, and I used to tell the former director of Marine Fisheries all the time when he whined about commercial fishermen and how mean they were and how they just didn't understand anything, is you have to think about it. Anybody that had any inclination to do anything else had already left. Anybody that had another skill had already left. You know, what's left of commercial fishing right now is like a really hardened group of survivors. Like, they're the ones that are going to do it no matter what. It's kind of like me living where I live. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but they're going to do it anyway. So in working with Fisheries Association, I was constantly up against this. They didn't want to change the way they fished. And I would tell them all the time, nobody promises you that you get to fish the way your granddaddy fished. I want you to keep fishing. Nobody promises you get to do it the same way forever. There are a lot of fine families that made typewriters. Nobody uses typewriters anymore. You know, you just don't get promised the same. What I saw there, to connect it to this, is people want to regulate commercial fishermen to death to make them do what they think they should do. What I have seen is that education and getting people involved in understanding why it's necessary rather than just regulating them seems to be so much more effective. If you can get somebody to understand the benefits of a turtle excluder and how it will keep them from having to stand on the back of the deck calling out all night or bycatch reduction devices, you're so much more likely, if you work with them to develop that technology and treat them with respect, to get them to cooperate and actually come to a better mechanism in the end than just this kind of, I'm going to regulate you. So that's my concern a lot of times with regulation. I don't know much about the development at this point. Like I said, I'm sure I'm getting ready to find out. But I do know about regulations in commercial fishing, and I do feel like what Karen's saying about education is incredibly important. I think it's just, on the whole, for so many different issues, just a better approach.
Well, that ends the time we have scheduled for the formal part of this program. The panel has generously agreed to talk to people afterwards if people would like to come up and have a word with them. I would like to thank all of you for a wonderful program. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. I enjoyed it immensely. I'm sure we all did. And thank you so much, Baxter and Ryan, for this wonderful work and the ongoing conversation that it started and will continue to have.
Thank you so much for having us.
Please join me in giving everybody a huge round of applause.